So I want to do a little bit of an introduction for our guests. So we've got Shlomo Kramer here. He was founder and CEO of Checkpoint Software, one of the very first cybersecurity companies. He is now founder and CEO of Cato Networks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And to his left, we've got Roy Reznik, co-founder and Vice President of R&D for a company many of you in this room have heard of, which is Wiz. Wiz was in the news this summer for rejecting a $23 billion buyout by Google, which I will also ask him about in a minute. And to my right here, we've got Ellison Anne Williams, founder and CEO of a company called Enveil. Enveil makes a very interesting encryption technology that we will talk about in a minute here. And so, Roy, I wanted to start with you. I wanted to get kind of a business question out of the way before we get to really the substance of this conversation. Again, this summer, Wiz rejected a $23 billion acquisition offer from Google. The company said at the time that you wanted to stay private. You set a target of $1 billion in annual recurring revenue for 2025 to be your threshold for an IPO. Is there any update or guidance you're able to offer us about how far along that path you are?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. I think that one is we've just passed $550 million ARR, so we are very well along the path of reaching $1 billion. I think that we've received throughout the years many very flattering offers that, like I told you, have gotten more aggressive lately, but we really believe in our ability and our path to reach a public company that is very successful, significantly more successful than now. The cloud security market is $30 billion. It is growing in a staggering pace of 20% year over year, which is incredible. And I think that one of the major key points is that even though people have been talking about cloud for so long, probably 15 years now, and you probably have the feeling like the cloud is so mature, only 15% of workloads have migrated to the cloud. So it is really just in its baby steps. So we believe it is a huge market that is going to significantly grow over the next few years, and that's one of the reasons why we believe we can build an incredible public company.
That's terrific. And as I want to do for all of the panelists on stage here, I want to give you a little snapshot of what the technology actually does. I find that's useful for kind of anchoring our understanding of why these folks are on stage with us today. And Roy, again, I'll come back to you, and then we're going to open it up a little bit. The theme of the conference is trust in technology, and within that, the topic of this conversation is, dude, where's my data? Protecting your information in the cloud. The backstory to this is a big part of my job as a cybersecurity reporter has become reporting on ransomware, cyber extortion, mass attacks against entire industries that will happen overnight when some sort of vulnerability is disclosed in some piece of technology. And what I found in the reporting is that you dig into these cases, and what you'll find is that sometimes very sophisticated, well-resourced, very large companies with good cybersecurity teams will still find themselves victims of these hacks because they weren't able to patch a vulnerability fast enough, or they simply lost track of where their data was in the cloud, on their network. They didn't have good inventory. I was talking to Roy earlier about kind of what Wiz actually does. The snapshot of it is they've developed a tool for scanning very, very quickly the virtual machines on a client's cloud computing network and determining what data's on it, what software programs are on it, and how do we prioritize security fixes. So, Roy, I was hoping you could kind of kick this off by talking about when you see news of these big data breaches, typically involving these days a publicly disclosed vulnerability that could not be more loudly disclosed to the world, but yet some companies will take weeks or months or longer to fix them. Can you talk about why we're seeing so many of those breaches from your perspective, and why a tool like Wiz's might be what's needed?
Yeah. I think security is a process, right? And I think the first part of the process is first discovery. It is very difficult to just know everything that you have and make sure that you are aware of all the assets you have in your organization. That's one of the things we feel is very strong at Wiz. You connect us within 5 minutes, and then there are no blind spots. But then you have so many things to fix. It is very hard for you to understand what to fix first and what to fix later. So the second part is prioritization. It's about the bigger context of, it's not just about how severe this vulnerability is. It's about, if I'm an attacker who gets in, what kind of data can I access? What kind of different types of things I can do within your environment, like can I hop to different VMs and then access sensitive data? So like looking at this wide context and prioritizing what I should fix first and what I should fix next is something that's very missing today in the cloud. And I think that the last part of this, like we call it the cloud security journey, is democratization. So basically security teams today, they don't fix things themselves. They send it to the development teams that need to fix it. But those developers, the first thing on their mind is, how do I release this feature? It's not, how do I fix this vulnerability that this security guy who's not even my manager sent me, right? So it's about, how do I make them interested? How do I create the right context for them to look at this and say like, oh, wow, that is very dangerous. It's not just a vulnerability. It can access this type of data. It is open to the internet. Like giving the context that will make the developers interested in fixing what you find. So democratizing it is like the last step of making a mature cloud security practice.
So we've moved to a place where we have people who are not security people responsible for securing devices. That's why you might wind up weeks or months after a vulnerability has been disclosed. That's why some of these companies get breached. Shlomo, I'll go to you as well. Shlomo Kramer, again, is founder and CEO of a company called Cato Networks, which is kind of adjacent to this. And Shlomo, your kind of big pitch is that as networks have gotten more complex, in part because of companies you have created yourself.
Right.
What you have is that networks that are harder to manage as you solve.
IT security in general is becoming ever more difficult to manage, more complicated. 10 years ago, there would be no place for a company like Wiz. Today, we have Wiz just in the very beginning of its life cycle. For startups, it's great. But for a CISO that now needs to protect an ever-growing infrastructure, that now has cloud mobility, work from everywhere, networking, endpoints, has attackers that are becoming more and more sophisticated with AI, and has a much more demanding digital business that requires high velocity, that makes the equation for that CISO so much more difficult. So it's not surprising that since COVID, the percentage of spend on IT security out of IT budget has grown more than 40%, while the losses from data breaches has grown almost 50%.
And to give a sense of what...
Yeah.
Sorry.
And just take a simple example of patching appliances, right? Any appliance, Citrix, Fortinet, whatever. Everybody's got vulnerabilities. But if I'm a retailer and I've got 1,500 stores around the world with no IT and a business that needs to be conducted over the weekends and change controls and whatnot, and in each store I've got 3-4 appliances, and I've got cloud properties, and I've got endpoints, remote workers, and I need to manage all of that, then I simply don't have the budget to fix this vulnerability. So I keep it open.
And to give a sense
and attacked.
And to give a sense of what Cato Networks does, it's essentially saying all of that hardware, that network hardware that is vulnerable, that you need to fix, we will take control of that. We will do that in the cloud. We will do that for you. And Ellison Anne, I wanted to bring this to you as well, is that so Enveil is a company that Ellison Anne founded and is CEO of. She's a mathematician and a former senior researcher with the U.S. National Security Agency. I wanted her on the panel because this is kind of the other end of this equation. So what Shlomo and what Roy are talking about are how do you protect networks from hackers? The problem that Ellison Anne is working on is kind of the other end of that spectrum. Let's say you are a bank, let's say you're a multinational, let's say you're a government agency. You already have really good security, or at least kind of as good as you're going to get. But you have rules in place about which data you can access and where. So Ellison Anne has been talking to me about data localization laws. Now we have dozens of countries around the world that have very serious privacy and security laws about where you can take your data. So she offers the example of a Singaporean bank. If you are a UK bank with a Singaporean outpost, it's not very easy to ask questions of that data. The result is you have cyber criminals, money launderers, and others that are taking advantage of this and taking advantage of blind spots. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how Enveil's technology works and how it helps catch cyber criminals, how it helps stop money laundering, and how it helps solve this problem of security rules that are well-intentioned that may wind up creating blind spots for banks and other multinationals.
Yep. So privacy-enhancing technologies, which is one of the core pillars you're referencing, is called homomorphic encryption, really allows any type of organization, in this case you mentioned a bank, to be able to securely and privately use data where it is and as it is across boundaries and across silos. And of course the boundaries and silos around data aren't getting fewer, they're only increasing. Now in your example, the boundary and silo are operating jurisdictions, for example, of the same multinational organization, financial services institution, but it could very easily be between organizations like banks. So in the case of financial crime, you're exactly right. So for the example in Singapore, if you're banking an entity in Singapore and you're watching them for questionable activity and you want to know, very simply, is this Singaporean entity being banked anywhere within my own bank? It seems like a very reasonable request. It's a very difficult one to get the answer to in practice, because in that case, the boundaries or silos are driven by data localization and residency types of rules. But exactly as you mentioned, you can take that question for are you banking the Singaporean entity, encrypt it through privacy-enhancing technologies in the form of an encrypted search in Singapore, send it out, for example, to the UK operating jurisdiction. It can process out there without ever being decrypted, so no Singaporean information is ever going to be revealed outside of Singapore. You get your encrypted results back in a matter of seconds, and you can see, wait a minute, the Singaporean entity that I'm watching for questionable activity, maybe relating to money laundering or fraud in Singapore, is actually being banked by the UK jurisdiction of my own bank, and perhaps they're also watching them for questionable activity. So it changes the game and the aperture in connecting those dots across boundaries and silos, operating jurisdictions, between banks, like I said before, in a way that otherwise is never possible.
So what I like about this is, covering cybersecurity, we used to cover a lot, we still do espionage, kind of higher-end nation-state type of threats. What Ellison Anne is talking about is, let's say, a bank, but now we have ransomware, cyber extortion. The financial crime aspect has really exploded. Part of the reason is all of these new security rules have created unintended consequences. And I wasn't aware of this until we started talking, which is that now you have blind spots, and now you have banks that cannot see if hacker 12345 has an account in Singapore and also has an account in the UK and is washing their money through the bank. So there are these blind spots that are being addressed. And Roy, I wanted to go back to you as well. On this theme of trust in technology, there's been a lot made about the fact that if you go to the cloud, you're giving your network to companies that have many more resources than your business might have. To this question earlier about, do you feel your employer is secure, against a data breach? It's like, yes, definitely, a lot of people feel that way. The data shows actually, in some countries, close to 100% of the people have been victims of a data breach. So, data breaches come for everybody eventually. What is your sense and what is your argument to clients when the argument for going to the cloud is you're now turning your service over to a Microsoft, an Amazon, a Google that has many more resources than your company to protect your data? But we've also seen breaches, Microsoft's a great one, where we've seen breaches of those systems. What is your argument for why the cloud is actually safer because of technologies like yours and others?
Yeah, so I think it is very, very rare that the breach actually starts within the cloud provider. I don't think that's, obviously that can happen just like it can happen to anyone, but the amount of resources that they can invest in security is probably 10 or 50 times larger than your organization, right? I mean, moving to the cloud reduces companies' risk. It does not increase the risk, right? And I also think that the cloud offers many technologies that can significantly help you protect your environment on the applicative level as well. So in my opinion, moving to the cloud makes your security better, not worse.
Yeah. Shlomo, I'll go to you as well. Obviously, you've been in the industry a long time. You founded Checkpoint Software in 1993. At that time, there might have been a handful of big publicly traded cybersecurity companies. You've seen big cycles in this industry. Right. I want to talk to you a little bit about where do you think we're at now in terms of the fight against hackers? Are we winning? Are we losing? The reason I ask that is the industry's never been bigger. Yeah. $200 billion in revenue for this industry this year alone, and yet we still see big breaches.
I think we are at a very important point, and I'm glad that you asked that, because for the last 30 years, the cybersecurity industry has focused on the what. And, there's a huge growing number of startups, each one solving a point products Wiz is an exception as a platform company for the cloud. Cato is an exception as a platform company for the network. Perhaps CrowdStrike is an exception for the endpoint. But otherwise, you've got thousands of these companies. And now the average CISO needs to consume all of this and deliver a security solution. And as I mentioned earlier, this is becoming unattainable within budget, within headcount. So there needs to be a focus on a new innovation, and the new innovation is the how, not the what. It's like a pharmaceutical company that focused on the molecule and completely forgot to develop a delivery mechanism, right? So the next 10 years are going to be on delivery mechanism, and delivery mechanisms are platforms. How do you build a platform? There's a ton of IP that goes into that. It's much more difficult. It's not going to be for every startup, but the winning companies of the future are going to be platform companies. And we are seeing portfolio companies that recognize that and are calling the same platformization because they are trying to fit themselves, they are smart enough to understand the future, trying to fit a portfolio company to become a platform company.
Can you offer a little bit more detail? You touched on this earlier. What the process looks like to actually update a piece of equipment. I find this interesting because, again, at the core of most of the big breaches we see and we write about, and you mentioned this earlier.
Yeah, so if you have a platform like Cato, which is the AWS for IT security, right? We take the grunt work and we do it for you. The process is zero. We were the first one to come out with a patch for Log4j in less than 24 hours. All of our customers had a test, silently tested, silently deployed patch, and the budget on their side was zero. On the other hand, that retailer that we talked about earlier with 1,500 appliances of some Generation 2 appliance company, portfolio company, had to understand what is the change window for each one of the location, understand who needs to do that. They don't have technical stuff in each one of the locations. It's extremely difficult and expensive, especially as you've got multiple of these appliances all over the place.
Yeah, I think this piece is important about having physical assets in places. We're still in a world where most organizations have physical assets in places, and we saw this with the CrowdStrike update fiasco a few months ago, which was bad update went out all over the world, machines got crashed, very easy fix for it, but required you to be there in person to update the systems and restart the systems. So what Shlomo is talking about is that whenever you see these big breaches, there's a lot of like victim shaming that happens kind of online after a company gets breached and it comes out there was a publicly disclosed vulnerability and this company waited maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe even longer to fix that vulnerability. What we found in our reporting and some of our reporting, sometimes there are very reasonable reasons behind why those vulnerabilities were not fixed. However, it does take some digging, it does take some examination. And Ellison, I wanted to get back to you a little bit. Obviously, you're a former senior researcher with the NSA. You've worked a lot and work a lot in national security environments. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that are unique to both large banks, multinationals, and government agencies when it comes to their ability to access their own data? I find this to be an interesting problem, whether it's data localization rules, classification rules, security requirements. It seems to me that a lot of these large companies, even if they have great security on the outside, there are very strict rules about their ability to access internally their own data, and that can lead to security problems. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Accessing data, using data is equally hard everywhere, is my conclusion. Why? Because you've got these boundaries and silos around data, as we talked about before, and that comes in so many different forms. So for a large, like we talked about, multinational organization, those could be driven by this kind of heterogeneous regulatory data residency landscape. But for example, drug companies or pharma companies doing pharmaceutical research, drug research, et cetera, data that's driven by more, sensitivity around health information, for example. Now, if you go into the national security and defense space, those boundaries and silos are just as real. They're just driven for different reasons. Security classification, as you pointed out, need to know, et cetera. But in order to get the actionable insights from the data, you have to, of course, that's called using the data. You've got to run a search, an analytic, run or train a machine learning model over it, right? Very buzzy right now with AI. But that data has to be available to you to use. But if it's locked away, you can't really get the insights from it. So problems everywhere.
And the Enveil technology, just to be clear, boiling it down, what it essentially does, it allows you to encrypt a question to your data set and encrypt the answer. So in the case of the Singaporean bank, you can ask your Singaporean division, do you have an account belonging to hacker 12345? You can encrypt the question, encrypt the answer, and get an answer back yes or no without ever sending that information overseas and violating some of these privacy rules, which I find very interesting. And you mentioned something else as well. In the age of AI, the AI algorithm that you are using to interrogate your data itself can violate privacy and security rules because of what you are sending over the transom. Can you talk a little bit about that why you would need any of these kinds of security technologies to protect the act of asking an AI to operate on some other piece of data?
Yes, yeah. So the tool called AI, of course, has become really buzzy with Gen AI for good reason. But the unit of work in AI is machine learning models. And so what's always been true, but come to awareness more than we've ever seen it really historically, is the fact that the machine learning models encode the data over which they were trained. So if that data has any sensitivity to it whatsoever, for example, if I've trained it over Singaporean data, then sending this model out to now go run and be evaluated, say, across boundaries in the UK is essentially the same thing as taking that Singaporean training data and moving it over to the UK. Huge problem. So that's where privacy-enhancing technologies come in and help solve that, in that they can take that model that's been trained over sensitive data, encrypt the model, send the model over to be processed for evaluation inference is the technical term in the UK without ever being decrypted. If you don't decrypt the model, you can't see it. If you don't see the model, you never have an opportunity to pull out any of that sensitive data over which it's been trained. The same thing is true for training a model, which is called encrypted federated learning.
And ultimately, that's what this is about, is that even if you get breached, is your data still protected? Can the hacker steal anything useful from you? So all of these technologies, they do different things, and we've got, obviously a really great panel here. We're almost out of time. A question I'd like to ask each of you: are we winning or are we losing versus the hackers? Shlomo, I'll start with you, and
we are managing the problem.
Roy, what do you think? Are we winning or losing?
Yeah, I agree. It is a cat and a mouse. Like, it's never about winning or losing. It's about reinventing and innovating all the time in order to solve new issues that arise.
Ellison Anne?
I think we're losing. I think we've handcuffed ourselves in many, many ways, some of which we've talked about.
We are out of time. I so appreciate you guys making the time to come talk with us. Obviously, an amazing panel. Thank you guys for being here. We appreciate it.